It was wise for the movement to continue to try to occupy space and not to try to build a base. And that's something we could argue about when we talk about it if we have time for questions. But what it meant is that you ended up sort of sweating down the participants to who could survive as opposed to those people who might want to identify or rally or be part of the movement. And that's a difference clearly in the Arab Spring, which is still engaging people in a fundamental way. The Occupy movement was also not a diverse movement largely. It was largely youngish, anarchisty looking, white. I mean, it wasn't really something that looked like America in the way that we understand it. And the fact that the encampments also made the, helped the city structures, paint them as sort of collections and aggregations of the homeless as opposed to people who were really trying to get change was also a huge problem in Occupy. Not having been here this morning, I hope I'm not saying everything different than what you've heard, but if so, I'm a big boy, we'll get there. What does matter to me is the movements themselves. Right now, ACORN International, and I think we were even getting ready to do this the last time I was here, but a big issue for us in our 13 countries is financial injustice. What do you do with remittances? People know what remittances are, the transfer of money from migrant workers or from immigrant families back to family, family to neighbors, back to their home communities in whatever country they're from. The problem with remittances is that because they're extra national and aren't regulated at all really by anybody, even if the major industrial and financial countries in the World Bank say, as we agree, that there should be no more than a 5% charge for all remittances, these charges aren't being regulated by national banking systems or anything else, so some people lard up charges of 15, 20, 25%. Western Union, MoneyGram, many others. Anybody ever use remittances? Do you know what I'm talking about at all? Anybody have relatives in another country? How do you get money to them? That's a remittance. Your process of sending that money is called a remittance. Remisas in Spanish, remittance, okay? And it's multi-billion. If you could take the predatory fee structure out of remittances, more money would go directly between families and families, migrant workers and families. It dwarfs the level of the total foreign aid budgets of all countries in the world. So we actually, even in this time of a terrible economy, if we kept people from banking institutions, Western Union, money transfer organizations, if we prevented them from picking the pockets of the poor, we ourselves could finance a foreign aid program that would do more for developing undeveloped countries than any of the high-minded NGO-based European, US, Canadian backslapping programs about, hey, we're putting our little 1% of GNP over to Africa or Asia or wherever. Yet winning this campaign on a global level is almost impossible because there's not a movement. There's an action in Canada. I actually love this guy. Here's how small the world can be. I know it's big. We organized in Korogocho in Nairobi, which is the oldest mega-slum in Nairobi. And for those of you who know Africa, it's not the largest. Kibera, that was featured in the movie Constant Gardener, that's the largest and the one that gets the most publicity, but Korogocho is where we work and that's the oldest. This young man is a leader in our Vancouver organization, and he actually trained as an organizer in Korogocho. He's from Korogocho. He actually sends money from Vancouver to Korogocho, and then turns out to be one of our members and a leader of our organization in Canada. Love those stories. Love those stories. Only in this world. And what he has to pay for every $100 is almost $30 to transfer 100. Doesn't have a choice but to use Western Union. Why? There are some other choices. It's the only one on a secure enough route for his mother to be able to go to that location, pick up the money, and it gets a little bit less of an exchange rate. Something like this is something I think we could all agree has to be changed. Yes. Ironically, there's even a story in the New York Times. Usually when something finally gets in the New York Times, it must be a day or two before it's going to change. They finally noticed it. But There's even a story today about how people are ripped off on remittances. But my point is that we can't make this change until there's something almost like a prairie fire that burns everything in front of it. That there needs to be a movement to make this level of change. And unless we're able to listen more carefully and to understand what people are saying and how to respond to their issues, no matter what organizational capacity we have, it can't get the job done as quickly as we need. So we just introduced on May 31st a bill in the Ontario legislature to put a hard ceiling of 5% on remittances. There's nothing that's been introduced in the United States. I can tell you before the end of the year it'll be introduced in Honduras. We have a project now with the Clinton School of Public Service and several interns that are in Mexico City with us right now, helping us identify somebody who can introduce this legislation in Mexico City. But we need to lead this in the United States. We need to lead in so many other places, but it'll take us years to actually get something passed that finally stops these institutions from robbing from poor people. But if we had a movement, a real commitment that all of us could lend our voices to for social change, a movement like we see, whether it's in Occupy or in the Arab Spring, our chances of change dramatically and radically. And that's what we need now. I think the Arab Spring teaches those kinds of lessons country after country, even though it's a constant struggle to not be co-opted, to actually realize the change that many people demanded in organizing in the Middle East. These are not revolutions that end. These are revolutions that are ongoing if they're to affect the kind of change we want. And I think Occupy Wall Street speaks to, for all of its shortcomings and flaws, speaks to how desperate people are about inequity and so many issues in our country that we're willing to even see that as inspiring, as something that is worth us paying attention to, as something that starts to be a game changer in how people have the debate. But I want to leave you with one thing that we learned in New Orleans, and it used to be on a lot of refrigerators. After Katrina, I live in New Orleans, I may not have said that, but after Katrina, you had to wrap, your refrigerators were dead. Electricity had gone out, food was in it, spoils it. It was a pretty nasty thing. So there became sort of a cultural thing about refrigerator art. People would put their refrigerators with masking tape out for the garbage, and people would write slogans on it, call me when a boat's coming, or, help me rebuild, or I'm in here, let me out, or, whatever. It depends, people. And my favorite was always one that was on a lot of refrigerators that said, hope is not a plan. And thinking about movements and the work before us, I'd like to leave that little Katrina slogan. Hope is not a plan. We've got lots of work to do. Thank you very much. I don't know how the time does run. Do we have a minute or two for questions, or? Okay, and you'll tell me, but maybe nobody has a question. Maybe this is all so easy. Anybody got a question? Yo!
If we could put together a plan like that to help out in Katrina, why can't we expand it?
Oh, I obviously think we can. Why don't we?
Okay, so where does it start from? I mean, I understand that.
How about you and me?
But now, how will we get it started? This is what I'm saying.
Who said that?
I understand that, but to get it going, where would it start? How would you go about to get it started? Let me rephrase that.
There's so many ways I could answer this question. I could say, look, I've done this for all these years. Here's the 3 things I would do. But I think really how you get it started is as simple as finding other people who you're listening to who are thinking the same thing you are. Common interests, common issues. Even personal issues. The dialectic of politics is personal issues that become public issues. So you'd be surprised when you're talking if you care about something that other people sometimes care about the same thing. And that's simple, I think, as it's not about Facebook, it's still face-to-face, it's still real people talking to real people. Facebook is a great communications tool, Twitter, if you can write that, as Shaq says, anybody can do 134 characters, but, you know, it still is getting people in a room saying, hey, why don't we do this? And what's the harm? And then you build from there. And if enough people are doing this, it starts to be something different than what you might have imagined. When I first started ACORN in 1970, I remember some of the first meetings I had in Little Rock. I was all 21 years old, right out of Springfield. Luckily, I was at the age where, you know, at 21, you know everything. And if it hadn't been for that, I probably never would have started either. But I did know everything at 21, so after a year up here in Massachusetts organizing welfare rights, I knew everything I thought welfare rights had done right and everything we could do better at this thing called ACORN if I could just figure out how to make it go. And sometimes you'd be sitting here in somebody's living room with 2 or 3 people. And at 21, you still know how to count 2 or 3 people, and you know, you're talking about how you're going to change everything in the country, and you know how small and insignificant that is. But it turns out, the more you keep doing it, persistence itself and the clarity of the vision about change is sometimes enough to get it started, because it turns out a lot of people, a lot more skills than you have, are ready to go too. They're just waiting for some fool like you to say, well, why don't we go? Well, I'll go too. And then they're half a mile ahead of you. Yes, ma'am.
I think you talk about getting people engaged and full-on engagement. I think one of the barriers to that is how the information is discussed and represented in it. So a lot of the talk is very academic, and people feel like, I don't really know what you're saying, and it's too, no one wants to feel dumb, basically. And it's not, the information is not broken down in a way that's clear for people to understand the problem and the issue and what's really at the heart of it. So what I'd like to know is, do you think things like popular culture, like arts and entertainment and documentaries and things like that, do you think that's kind of an underutilized resource in terms of social movements?
Sure. I mean, people ask me, organizing, internationally largely, which I do now, how many languages you know? And I said, look, I'm still working on English, and I have a very passing relationship with that, English and Spanglish. But the truth is, we all are still working on English. How to communicate as simply and clearly as possible. Well, that's not 500 words, that's sometimes 5 words. And if somebody has the skill, I wish I had it, my handwriting, I can't read the next day, much less say that I can draw something or whatever. But it really is. I mean, we have these tools. I couldn't even think about doing international organizing if it weren't for the internet and Skype. All of a sudden, I mean, those don't solve all the problems, but it does mean I can try to communicate, and there's this thing called Google Translate. It turns out it works with Hindi, it works with Italian, it works with Spanish. Now sometimes, I worry about that 20% I'm not getting. I could get into a lot of trouble some places. But the point is, there are tools that, when I started work, I couldn't even imagine that you have right here in front of you, ready to go. This is all of my 5th PowerPoint I've ever tried to do. I felt like I should really, represent. Fancy speaker. I mean, all of a sudden, I wouldn't have done it except I saw the poster early, and I saw they all of a sudden promoted me to like a doctor. It's Dr. Rathke, and here's a college dropout. Somehow this is going to make my mother happy. At least I can do a, PowerPoint. But the point is all about communication. And sometimes this way, there's something I'm comfortable with, there's something you're hearing. In India, particularly in Mumbai, we organized in Dharavi. Anybody see the movie Slumdog Millionaire? Okay, thank God, finally hit, almost a majority. It was a big movie, Academy Award, hey. Well, Dharavi is the slum where that movie was. And so the Tiwala and other, that's where we organize rag pickers, and we have a sorting center, and we have a little, small ass school and whatever. But we do a lot of organizing. We made a deal with a jazz club called the Blue Frog. And what they do that's good for us is every month they have people come in from all over Europe and fancy people playing. We made a deal with them that every other month they'll let us have one of those people to come down to a musical workshop or do some sort of a concert for our folks in Rathke. Well, we use it as an organizing tool. They probably think, oh, well, our people will feel better, and the young kids and whatever, and it's out here in the slums and blah.